Okay. If countries are developing innovations, inventions in space, for example, growth of new agricultural products and vaccines, will these be bound by the national law of country of origin or under international law? And I might direct that question to Professor Freeland.
There are different layers of law that apply in the space domain. As I said, there is this international framework, and for those of you who understand the way international law works, by and large, that binds all of the countries. And as I said, Australia is a party to all of those treaties. Most of the major countries are a party to at least 4 of them. There's one other treaty, our favourite one, called the Moon Agreement, which Australia is a party to, but it's only got 18 states parties. That's for another story. So those principles will direct and guide the way that countries have to engage with space, and gives them responsibilities and obligations. Then as increasingly private sector comes into space, those countries themselves, with responsibilities under this treaty regime, have to then regulate, authorise, supervise those within their jurisdiction. So hence they pass national space law, which is the relationship between the country and those within its jurisdiction. And so a combination of both of those things will be relevant essentially to any space activity. Of course, it's up to the country as to what and how broadly it shapes its national laws, bearing in mind that it will have these international responsibilities. But certainly for some of the things that were mentioned in the question, many countries are absolutely cognizant of the way that these technologies are utilised in space for a whole range of reasons. And therefore, I think they will guide that in their national law, but the international principles certainly also have obligations on those states to do that.
The question comes from Professor Roy Tasker. Global issues like the climate crisis, potential of threats of artificial intelligence, and space policy and security require a global perspective. How can we have this with nationalist politics? And I might start with you, Ben.
Yeah, that's a doozy.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can with nationalist politics. I think that if you can set up an international legal regime that means people have to legislate in their own self-interest, then that might be a way forwards there. But that is someone else's wheelhouse.
Can I have a go? I think if we can create the United Nations after World War II, we are absolutely capable of creating things to actually make big problems that affect all of the world have an opportunity to be worked on. We just have to have the political will and the determination and great leaders to actually make that come about.
Thank you. Excellent question. And it touches on the highly complex nature of space. But I think I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic than Ben. I'm not sure. In the end, there's a common interest amongst everybody engaged in space, every country, let's say, engaged in space, because as we've heard, particularly with debris, but not only, once we reach a tipping point, and Nikki referred to the Kessler syndrome, but once we reach a certain tipping point, that is irreversible, to use Ben's expression. Our technology is not good enough to clean up, de-junk. In fact, we're constantly adding to the junk. So if we reach that tipping point, everybody suffers. And the thing about space is those that suffer the most are indeed the largest countries in the world, the most powerful, because they are the most dependent on space for their superiority. You saw the slides, or their perceptions of superiority, but therefore the most vulnerable if the ability to access space. And so in the end, of course, there's argy-bargy and strong nationalist views and terrestrial competitiveness. We understand that. But in the end, at some point, and this is what I was trying to refer to about some lines that won't be crossed, there's a common interest, even amongst those who are, opponents terrestrially, that we need to keep our access to space relatively uncompromised, notwithstanding the fact that we want to be the biggest and the best. And they might sound irreconcilable. I don't think they are, but it's tough.
Big history has shown that humankind cannot live in peace and cooperation. I think that's partly true. A comment from the floor here. I think that's partly true, but we also need to look on the optimistic side, and sometimes big history has shown that we can live in peace. There are actually fewer people dying in wars now than ever before, but at the same time, we have big history has shown some very big failings to live in peace and cooperation. Witness the new arms race, the Paris Agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, and others. Will space be different? Will mutual annihilation be the deterrent again?
I think space won't be different because it's humans trying to fix things. We do learn, but we learn slowly. So I am hopeful, but I think mutual annihilation is actually probably going to motivate us most to actually do something.
I think that threat of mutual annihilation kind of worked for a long time there. Maybe not optimal, but it's got us out of trouble for the last 60 odd years. I think that because the stakes are so high in space, and they're high for the right groups of people, I think that is what's different about space. Because as Stephen said, the impact is the largest for the largest countries that have the ability to influence the international regimes that govern the stuff. So I think that's the difference.
Yep, thank you, and I completely agree. The risk is always there. I mean, even though perhaps in the end the most influential countries, but space is about everybody, of course, but the most influential countries will recognise what Ben said, that they will suffer the most. There's always the risk that somebody, perhaps with less to lose, so to speak, and we've heard references to rogue nations. It's not an expression I like, but we all understand that notion. There's always that risk, right? So there will always be the risk that we do mess it up to a point and that will set us back decades and decades and decades. But that aside, and in a sense, it's very difficult to stop those sort of things happening, but we will try. In the end, we need to frame, and this is what we're trying to do at the UN, although things move very slowly. We need to frame the dialogue not in the words of competitive, congested, and what was the third one? Contested. Because in a sense, with great respect, using those are self-fulfilling prophecies. And likewise, the Wild Wild West. They're self-fulfilling. If you categorise space in those terms, they have an opponent aspect to them. And so we need to talk about, when we talk about the way to move forward with some of these regulations and codes, not talking about security and military and safety, but talk about environment and talk about access and talk about sustainability. Now, again, as Donna said, it's just words, but it's a mindset. And that's why there are many voices about space. We hear loud voices. Absolutely, we have to listen to loud voices, but we need to listen to every voice and frame the way we think about space, taking into account every perspective. In the end, if we all decide we want to kill each other and shoot it up, well, we can't stop. But my suspicion is if we have that holistic view of space, and it's very difficult, but if we do that, in the end, I think, subject to the so-called rogue state or whatever scenario, I think we will stop, as we did, as Ben said, during the Cold War period, even though we got very close sometimes to the unthinkable.
Can I just want to say one last very quickly? I think the biggest risk is when the politicians who are making these decisions don't understand how important space is and how potentially damaging space debris is. So this is the right people to ask, can you all talk to your powerful friends and make sure that they all understand?
last night Stephen and I were talking about what is the basis of international law, and Stephen was saying to me, I'd love to steal the idea, but it was actually you that said it, that international law emerges from common interests. We'd like to say it emerged from ethics, but sadly, where ethics are not necessarily common amongst every nation, where we can identify common interests, that's where international law comes from. And certainly one of those common interests is that we don't blow ourselves up and that we don't destroy the space domain. But there are also positive common interests about using space for humanity, using this global commons in a way that helps humanity in every country to prosper. Thank you.